Part I. The Birth of a Shadow. The men digging the trench thought it was just another delay. Interstate 81 had already swallowed farms, creeks, and a forgotten cemetery or two as it pushed through northern Pennsylvania. When the shovel struck something solid, the foreman cursed, expecting rock. Instead, a curved white shape rolled out of the dirt and stared back at them with a hollow eye socket. By sundown, the site was sealed. State troopers stood smoking by their cruisers. What they pulled from the ground was incomplete: a skull, several long bones, scraps of fabric fused with soil. No wallet, no name, just the quiet certainty that this person had been buried deliberately and a long time ago. No one there could have guessed the story began more than 15 years earlier. 1956. Binghamton, New York. Edward Callahan was the kind of man people forgot 5 minutes after meeting. 32 years old, married, employed at a regional freight company where he managed shipping logs with careful, immaculate handwriting. He wore gray suits, brown shoes, and never spoke unless spoken to. His neighbors described him as polite and reliable. His wife, Margaret, would later say he was gentle, if distant. No arrests, no drinking problem. A veteran of the Korean War, honorably discharged. His file as thin as paper. Inside Edward's head, however, there was a persistent noise, an irritation he could never name. It followed him home from work, sat with him at dinner, and kept him awake while Margaret slept beside him. It was the sense that the world moved too freely, too messily, without consequence. People vanished every day, he had learned. Drifters, women running from bad marriages, men chasing work west. America was large, forgiving, and careless. The thought settled into him like a seed. The first time it happened, it was not planned. It was late October when Edward picked up the girl on Route 17. She stood with her thumb out, coat too thin for the cold, eyes sharp with the confidence of youth. She said her name was Lillian. She was heading toward Scranton. Edward told her he was going that way. They talked for 10 minutes, about music, about nothing. Edward listened, nodded, kept his eyes on the road. When she laughed, something inside him tightened, not desire, not anger, but a sudden need for silence. He turned off the highway without explanation. Lillian asked where they were going. Edward did not answer. When the car stopped near the tree line, she reached for the door. He struck her once, with the tire iron he kept under the seat for emergencies. The sound surprised him more than her body collapsing did. She did not die immediately. Edward stood there for several seconds, breathing hard, watching her chest fail to rise. The noise inside his head, constant for years, was gone. In its place was a clean, almost surgical calm. He buried her shallowly, hands blistered, heart steady. He burned her coat. He drove home before dawn, washed the blood from his hands, and kissed his wife on the cheek as she slept. The police ruled Lillian a runaway. Her parents in Ohio received a letter months later stating there were no further leads. Edward read about it in the paper at work, folded the page neatly, and threw it away. What stayed with him was not guilt. It was understanding. He had crossed a line and found nothing waiting on the other side. No punishment, no reckoning, just space. And in that space, Edward Callahan began to think not about what he had done, but about how easily it could be done again. Part 2: Patterns in the Dark. By 1961, Edward Callahan understood time differently. Years no longer passed as a single, continuous line. They broke into intervals before and after, tension and release. The first killing had not haunted him. It had clarified him. Life resumed its shape with surprising ease, as if nothing irreversible had occurred. Margaret grew older beside him. The freight company promoted him to regional coordinator. Neighbors waved. Church on Sundays. Meatloaf on Wednesdays. And beneath it all, patience. Edward learned that waiting was as important as action. He did not search for victims, he allowed them to appear. The second was a man this time. His name, Edward would later learn, was Thomas Riley, though at the moment he was simply a figure slumped on a bar stool in Elmira, drunk enough to trust a stranger. A former steelworker, recently laid off. He talked too much, complained about the government, about unions, about how no one noticed when men like him disappeared. Edward listened, always listened. When they left the bar together, it was almost companionable. Edward suggested a drive, a way to sober up. They ended near the Susquehanna River, where fog crawled low over the water. Thomas never saw the knife. Edward used it once, cleanly, the way he'd been trained years ago, in another country, another war. He weighted the body with scrap metal from his trunk and pushed it into the river. It vanished without drama. 2 deaths, 5 years apart. No connection anyone could see. Edward began to recognize what he was building, not a spree, but a rhythm. Long stretches of normality followed by moments of decisive control. He chose people who would not be missed loudly. People already slipping through the cracks of post-war America. In 1964, the third killing nearly didn't happen. The woman was older than the others, mid-40s, divorced, traveling between towns, selling cosmetics out of the trunk of her car. Her name was Helen Morris. Edward met her at a roadside diner outside Wilkes-Barre, where she sat alone, chain-smoking and reading a magazine. She struck up the conversation. That was new. Helen talked about loneliness with unsettling honesty, about motel rooms that all looked the same, about how freedom, once tasted, often turned bitter. Edward felt something unfamiliar then, a flicker of doubt. For a brief moment, he considered paying his bill and leaving. Instead, he offered her a ride to her motel. He strangled her with his hands. It was messier than before, more personal. When it was over, Edward sat in the car for nearly an hour, staring at the steering wheel, waiting for the noise to return. It didn't. What came instead was irritation at himself, at her, at the loss of precision. He buried Helen in a wooded area slated for development, marking the spot with a broken fence post only he would recognize. In her haste, she had left behind her sales case. Edward burned it, but kept the silk scarf she'd worn that night. He told himself it was a reminder, a lesson. By then, there were whispers. Not headlines, not panic, just rumors passed quietly between police departments, missing persons, bodies found years later with no clear cause, men in rivers, women gone from highways. No shared jurisdiction, no computers to link reports. Each case closed in isolation. In 1966, a young patrol officer in Scranton noticed something odd while reviewing old files. The disappearances formed a loose arc along major roadways. The time gaps were wide, but the geography felt intentional. He mentioned it to his supervisor. The comment was dismissed. Still, the file was copied, placed in a drawer, and years later, it would be opened again by a man who did not believe in coincidence. Edward sensed none of this. He felt only the slow tightening of the world around him, like a net being drawn invisibly through decades. He told himself he was careful, smarter than systems built on paper and memory. What he did not account for was accumulation, not just of bodies, but of traces. A scarf, buried bones, a river that would one day give something back. Part of 30. The case that would not stay buried. 1,969. The rain had softened the ground outside Harrisburg enough for the bulldozer to tear deeper than intended. When the machine stalled, its blade clogged with mud and roots, the operator climbed down to clear it by hand. What he uncovered was a shoe, brown leather, outdated, the sole partially dissolved by years underground. The excavation stopped within minutes. This time, the remains were more complete. A partial skeleton, fragments of clothing, and a woman's silk scarf knotted tightly around what had once been a neck. The scarf was remarkably preserved, its pattern faded but intact, A forensic pathologist estimated the burial to be at least 5 years old, possibly more. The file landed on the desk of Detective Samuel H. Granger of the Pennsylvania State Police, 46 years old, divorced. A man whose career had been built not on brilliance, but on stubbornness. Granger had the habit of reading reports others skimmed, of revisiting cases long after the department had grown tired of them. When he saw the scarf, something in his chest tightened. He requested missing persons reports from surrounding counties, then from neighboring states. Boxes arrived, paper files, yellowed and misfiled. Granger stayed late, smoking at his desk, marking maps with pencil. A pattern emerged, not clean, not obvious, but persistent. Disappearances clustered near highways, years apart, victims of different ages and genders, but similar circumstances. Last seen traveling, trusting, unanchored. And always, the investigations had stopped early. No witnesses, no pressure, no public demand. Granger reopened an old drawer and found the copied memo from 1966, the one written by a young patrol officer, now retired. The note mentioned geography, roads as veins, movement as opportunity. Granger circled the highways, Route 17, Interstate 81, the Susquehanna River. He felt, with growing certainty, that someone had been using the same spaces repeatedly, confident that distance and time would erase him. The fourth killing happened before Granger could act. In October of that year, a college student named Robert Jenkins disappeared while hitchhiking home to Syracuse for the weekend. His body was found 3 weeks later in a wooded ravine near the state line. Cause of death: blunt force trauma. No robbery, no sexual assault. But there was something else. In Jenkins's pocket, investigators found a matchbook from a bar in Elmira, closed since 1962. Granger drove there himself. The building was abandoned, windows boarded, the sign half rotted. He stood in the cold, imagining the place alive, men talking too loudly, a stranger listening too carefully. Edward Callahan read about the discovery in the newspaper over breakfast. This time, the noise came back. He had not meant for it to happen again, not so soon. Jenkins had recognized the bar name on the matchbook, asked questions Edward hadn't expected. Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, had guided his hand. The control he prized had slipped. For the first time, Edward made mistakes. He drove too close to home. He kept the car longer without cleaning it thoroughly. And when questioned casually by a local officer conducting door-to-door inquiries near the highway, Edward answered too precisely, too calmly. Granger noticed. The answers were correct but rehearsed. Edward's name appeared in no files, no criminal records. A veteran, a freight coordinator, a man who traveled extensively along the same routes as the victims. Not a suspect. Yet, Granger began building a timeline not just of the crimes, but of Edward's life. Transfers, promotions, addresses, always near the roads, always present, never visible. The scarf was tested again, fibers traced to a manufacturer in New York that had ceased production in the early 1960s. Rare, regional. Granger pinned a photograph of it to his board. 4 deaths, 13 years. Not a monster hiding in shadows. A man who lived in daylight and believed the past would stay buried. It wouldn't. Part 4. The net tightens. 1971. Detective Granger had learned to distrust sudden certainty. Years of police work had taught him that truth rarely announced itself. It leaked out slowly through repetition and pressure. Edward Callahan remained, on paper, an unremarkable man. But Granger had stopped looking for drama. He was looking for consistency. And Edward was everywhere. Travel logs from the freight company showed him driving the same corridors where the victims vanished. Not on the exact days, never that careless, but within windows that felt deliberate. Motel receipts placed him near Wilkes-Barre in 1964. Gas station records, still kept on carbon paper, confirmed a stop outside Elmira in 1961. None of it was proof. So Granger turned to the dead. The scarf, long boxed away, became central. A textile expert from New York identified the weave as part of a limited production run sold almost exclusively in northeastern department stores between 1959 and 1962. Granger canvassed old sales records. One store in Binghamton still had employee ledgers. Margaret Callahan's name was there. She had purchased the scarf in December 1960. Granger did not arrest Edward, not yet. He began surveillance, instead quiet, patient. He watched Edward drive to work, mow his lawn, attend church. He spoke to neighbors, who described a man who waved politely and never caused trouble. Edward felt the attention before he saw it. Cars that lingered too long. A man reading a newspaper twice across the street. Questions asked again, years later, about places and dates. The irritation inside his head sharpened into fear. He burned the scarf he had kept, but the smell of silk clung to the air, accusing. He made his final mistake when he returned to the construction site north of Harrisburg. Granger followed him. Edward said he was curious, that he'd heard about the bones on the news, but curiosity did not explain the shovel in his trunk, or the way his hands trembled when Granger asked about the past. The arrest was quiet. No chase, no confession, just handcuffs clicking closed beside a highway that had carried too many secrets. Search warrants followed. In Edward's garage, beneath loose floorboards, investigators found a box. Inside were personal items: a watch, a wallet without cash, a woman's compact, and a rusted knife wrapped carefully in cloth. Soil samples on the blade matched the burial site. Fibers matched the scarf. Margaret wept when she was questioned. She said she never knew. The neighbors watched from behind curtains. Edward said nothing. He sat in his cell, finally hearing the noise again, not irritation this time, but memory, faces, voices, the certainty that patience had betrayed him. The past, it seemed, had learned how to dig. Part 5. Judgment. 1973. The courtroom in Harrisburg was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the walls, notebooks ready, eager to put a face to the name they had finally been given. The Highway Murders, the headlines called it, as if a phrase could contain 13 years of absence. Edward Callahan sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit, his hair thinning, his expression unreadable. He did not look like a man capable of violence. That, the prosecution would argue, was precisely the point. Detective Samuel Granger took the stand on the third day of the trial. He spoke without flourish. He laid out timelines, maps, receipts, witness statements. He explained how roads created opportunity, how time created cover. When the scarf was introduced into evidence, its faded pattern displayed for the jury, there was an audible shift in the room. Margaret Callahan was called next. Her voice broke as she confirmed the purchase. She said Edward had asked her once where she'd bought it. She had thought nothing of it. The defense objected repeatedly, but the damage was done. The ordinary life Edward had hidden behind was unraveling thread by thread. The forensic testimony followed: soil composition, fiber analysis, the knife, the box of belongings found under the garage floor. Each item alone was circumstantial. Together, they formed a weight the jury could not ignore. Edward took the stand only once. He did not confess. He did not deny. He spoke of order, of people who fell through the cracks, of a country too large to notice its own dead. His voice was calm, almost instructional. When asked if he felt remorse, he paused for a long time. "I felt relief," he said finally. That word ended the trial. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The verdict: guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. Pennsylvania law allowed no ambiguity. The judge sentenced Edward Callahan to death by electrocution. The date would be set after mandatory appeals. Edward did not react. He nodded once, as if acknowledging a conclusion he had always known was coming. The execution took place in the winter of 1976. It was brief, clinical, witnessed by men who would carry the memory quietly for the rest of their lives. Detective Granger retired the following year. He kept the scar photograph in a box at home, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that patience could serve justice, but it could also shelter evil. The highway near Harrisburg was finished that spring. Cars passed over the ground where the first bones had been found, unaware of what lay beneath the asphalt. Time moved on, but it never truly erased anything.